A clue isn't hidden, it's simply overlooked. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into its customary evening quiet, with only the distant hoot of an owl and the gentle whisper of wind through the churchyard elms to disturb the peace. Street lamps cast pools of amber light along the narrow lanes, and behind drawn curtains, the good people of the parish had long since retired to their beds, with that particular satisfaction that comes from a day of small accomplishments and smaller gossips properly attended to. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy sitting room, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of long practice. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the familiar furnishings, and a cup of chamomile tea grew cold on the table beside her chair. She was working on a cardigan for her great-niece, though her mind wandered, as it often did in the evening hours, over the small incidents and observations that had marked the day. There had been young Mrs. Henderson at the post office, looking rather flustered and contradicting herself twice about when her husband would return from London. Then there was the matter of the new tenant at Rose Cottage, a Mr. Pemberton from the city who claimed to be writing a book on local history, yet seemed remarkably uninterested in the actual history when the vicar had offered to show him the parish records. Such small inconsistencies were the fabric of village life, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that they often formed patterns worth noting. The grandfather clock in the corner had just chimed midnight when the knocking began. It was not the tentative tap of a neighbor seeking assistance, nor the authoritative rap of officialdom, but something urgent and desperate, the sound of knuckles striking wood with barely controlled panic. Miss Marple set down her knitting with characteristic calm, though her blue eyes sharpened with interest. Midnight callers were rare in St. Mary Mead, and in her considerable experience, they invariably brought trouble of one sort or another. She moved to the window first, drawing back the lace curtain to peer into the darkness beyond. A figure stood on her doorstep, swaying slightly in the moonlight. A woman, Miss Marple judged, though it was difficult to make out details in the shadows. The visitor clutched at the doorframe as though it were the only thing preventing her collapse. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, hurrying to the front door as quickly as her aging joints would permit. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, immediately recognizing the woman who stumbled across her threshold. It was Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, wife of the mysterious new tenant, and she looked nothing like the composed, rather overdressed woman who had been the subject of considerable village speculation for the past fortnight. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her expensive silk dress was torn and stained, and her face was white with shock. "Miss Marple," she gasped, gripping the RTA. Older woman's arm with trembling fingers. "You must help me. Something terrible has happened at Rose Cottage. I came home from the church committee meeting and I found my husband in his study." Her voice broke on the last words. "He's dead, Miss Marple, and there's a poker beside his chair and blood on the carpet, and I don't know what to do." Miss Marple guided the distraught woman to the sitting room, settling her in the armchair by the fire before pouring a measure of brandy from the decanter she kept for medicinal purposes. "Now then, my dear," she said gently, resuming her own seat and picking up her knitting once more. She had found that people spoke more freely when they didn't feel the weight of direct scrutiny. "Tell me everything, from the very beginning. When did you last see your husband alive?" Mrs. Pemberton took a shuddering breath, the brandy bringing some color back to her cheeks. "This evening, just before 7. He said he had correspondence to attend to and shut himself in the study as usual. I went to the church for the flower committee meeting. We're planning the harvest festival arrangements. When I returned, just past 11, I called out to him, but there was no answer." She paused, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. The study door was ajar, which was odd. Harold always kept it locked when he was working. I pushed it open and saw him slumped in his chair. At first I thought he'd fallen asleep, but then I saw— She shuddered. The poker from the fireplace was on the floor beside him, and there was so much blood. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady clicking, but her mind was already turning over the details with the precision of a well-oiled mechanism. A locked study, a poker, and a man who claimed to be researching local history, yet avoided actual historical documents. The threads of a familiar pattern were beginning to emerge, though she would need considerably more information before she could see the complete picture. "Have you called the police, Mrs. Pemberton?" "No, I was too frightened. I ran here instead. Everyone says you're the wisest person in the village, and I didn't know where else to turn." Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for her coat. "Then we must remedy that immediately, my dear. Come, let us return to Rose Cottage together. The authorities must be notified, and the sooner the better." As they stepped out into the night air, Miss Marple reflected that her peaceful evening had come to an abrupt end. But then again, she had always found that the most interesting stories began with an unexpected knock at the door. The lane to Rose Cottage stretched before them like a dark ribbon, bordered by hedgerows that seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of shadows. Mrs. Pemberton clung to Miss Marple's arm with trembling fingers, her breathing shallow and uneven in the night air. The older woman maintained her characteristic steady pace, though her sharp eyes were already cataloguing details. The way the cottage's front door stood wide open, spilling yellow light across the overgrown garden, and the curious fact that every ground-floor window blazed with illumination, as if someone had been determined to banish every shadow from the house. "Wait here in the hallway, my dear," Miss Marple instructed gently as they crossed the threshold. The entrance was neat enough, with a row of coats hanging on wooden pegs and a small table holding the day's unopened post. 3 letters, Miss Marple noted, all addressed to Mr. Harold Pemberton in different hands, yet none had been opened despite their arrival that morning. The study door stood ajar exactly as Mrs. Pemberton had described. Miss Marple pushed it open with the tip of her walking stick, careful to disturb nothing. The room beyond was every inch the gentleman's sanctuary. Book-lined walls, a substantial mahogany desk positioned before the window, and 2 leather armchairs flanking a small fireplace that, curiously, showed no signs of recent use despite the evening's chill. Harold Pemberton occupied one of those chairs, his head lolled back at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. Blood had soaked into his white shirt collar and pooled on the Turkish carpet beneath. The brass poker lay nearby on the rug, positioned with an almost theatrical precision that made Miss Marple's eyebrows rise slightly. But it was the desk that truly captured her attention. Despite Mrs. Pemberton's assertion that her husband had spent the evening writing correspondence, the mahogany surface told a different story. Papers were stacked with military precision, a fountain pen lay capped and unused, and most tellingly, the silver inkwell sat bone dry, its contents long since evaporated. For a man supposedly engaged in 4 hours of letter writing, Mr. Pemberton had left remarkably little evidence of his industry. The window behind the desk stood unlatched, its curtains stirring gently in the night breeze. Anyone in the garden could have observed the room's occupant, or indeed gained entry with minimal difficulty. Yet something about the scene felt carefully arranged, like a stage set awaiting the arrival of its audience. "I shall telephone the police," Miss Marple announced, returning to the hallway where Mrs. Pemberton sat rigid with shock. The call was brief and efficient, requesting Inspector Slack's immediate attendance. Within 20 minutes, the peaceful silence of St. Mary Mead was shattered by squealing brakes and slamming car doors. Inspector Slack burst through the front door with his usual energy, his red face already showing irritation at being roused from his bed. "Miss Marple," he grunted, removing his hat with reluctant civility. "I might have known you'd be involved. I suppose you've already trampled over the evidence." "On the contrary, Inspector, Mrs. Pemberton and I have remained strictly in the hall. You'll find everything exactly as discovered." Slack signaled to his men, and soon the cottage buzzed with official activity. Miss Marple positioned herself unobtrusively by the study door frame, knowing that while Slack regarded her presence as a nuisance, He wouldn't forcibly eject her until the scene was secured. Burglary gone wrong. Slack pronounced after his initial examination. Windows been forced from outside. See these scratches on the sill? Fellow was working late. Heard a noise. Turned around and whack. Burglar panicked and fled. It would seem so, Miss Marple murmured, though her gaze remained fixed on the pristine desk and cold fireplace. Outside, the village was awakening to the drama. Lights flickered on in neighboring cottages, and Mrs. Bartlett's voice could already be heard carrying across the garden fence. Murder. I knew there was something odd about those two. Mr. Pemberton kept very strange hours for a historian. Miss Marple retreated to the sitting room, where Mrs. Pemberton sat twisting her handkerchief between pale fingers. "Dorothy," she said gently, settling beside the younger woman, "you mentioned your husband was in finance before deciding to write. What sort of business, exactly?" The slight hesitation before Mrs. Pemberton's answer was illuminating. Import and export, mostly. He had an office in the city. The words came too quickly, too rehearsed, like lines learned for a performance. As Dr. Haydock arrived to examine the body, Miss Marple stood and gathered her coat. She had seen enough for the moment. The official investigation would proceed along its predictable course, following the obvious trail of the forced window and the convenient poker. But Miss Marple had observed something rather different, a carefully constructed tableau designed to tell a specific story. The truth, she reflected as she stepped back into the night air, had a way of revealing itself through the smallest inconsistencies. A dry inkwell, a cold fireplace, and a widow whose grief seemed tinged with something that looked remarkably like relief. The real investigation, Miss Marple knew, was only just beginning. Behind her, Rose Cottage blazed with light against the darkness, while somewhere in the shadows of St. Mary Mead, a murderer waited to see if their carefully laid plans would survive the gentle but relentless scrutiny of an elderly lady with knitting needles and a lifetime's experience of human nature. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the tranquil facade of St. Mary Mead had acquired the brittle quality of thin ice over deep water. News of Harold Pemberton's violent death had traveled through the village with the peculiar efficiency reserved for scandal and sudden mortality, each retelling adding fresh embellishments until the facts had become thoroughly entangled with speculation. Miss Marple, who had managed perhaps 3 hours of restless sleep, found herself the unwitting center of attention as neighbors arrived with offerings of sympathy, curiosity, and barely concealed excitement. Mrs. Price-Ridley appeared first, her ample form filling the doorway before Miss Marple had finished her morning tea. "My dear Jane, I came immediately I heard. They say poor Mr. Pemberton was bludgeoned to death by a burglar, and that his wife discovered the body at midnight. Is it true you are summoned to the scene?" Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, noting how Mrs. Price-Ridley's eyes gleamed with the particular brightness that accompanied truly satisfying gossip. "Mrs. Pemberton did come here in considerable distress, yes. The police are handling the matter now. But surely you must have observed something. You always do." Mrs. Price-Ridley leaned forward conspiratorially. "I told my husband only last week that there was something peculiar about the Pembertons. They kept themselves too much apart, never joined in village activities properly. And that young architect, Mr. Fletcher, has been seen calling at Rose Cottage rather frequently for someone supposedly working on the old mill." Before Miss Marple could respond, the morning continued in similar fashion, each visitor bringing fresh theories and supposed facts. By noon, she had heard 6 different versions of events, ranging from interrupted burglary to elaborate insurance schemes. What struck her most forcefully was how readily everyone accepted the obvious explanation, despite its glaring inconsistencies. Her systematic tour of the village shops proved more illuminating than the morning's social calls. At Finch's Antique and Curio shop, she discovered that Harold Pemberton's expertise in historical matters was entirely fraudulent. The man wouldn't know a Jacobean chair from a modern reproduction. Mr. Finch confided, his thin face creased with professional disdain. "Came in here last week trying to tell me a clearly Victorian vase was Ming Dynasty. Wanted me to value it for insurance purposes. I told him I wouldn't put my name to such nonsense." This revelation cast Pemberton's supposed historical research in an entirely different light. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Finch and continued her rounds, filing away this crucial piece of information alongside her growing collection of inconsistencies. Inspector Slack intercepted her outside the post office, his red face already showing the irritation that accompanied any case requiring actual investigation. "Miss Marple, I thought I'd better get your statement before the whole village gets at you with their theories." "May I?" They settled in her sitting room, where Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man going through tedious formalities. Dr. Haydock puts death between 7 and midnight, probably earlier in that window. Mrs. Pemberton was at the church flower committee meeting from 7 until past 11. Half the parish can vouch for that. So we can set the wife aside for the moment. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Have you asked Mrs. Pemberton whether anything is missing from the house? Jewelry, money, papers?" "Nothing obvious," Slack admitted grudgingly. "These city types are secretive about valuables. We'll get that locked desk drawer open presently. There are clear footprints in the garden, boots, man's size, and the study window shows definite signs of forcing. Straightforward burglary." Miss Marple interrupted and turned violent. After Slack departed, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where she encountered old Tom tending the flower beds. His weathered hands paused on his spade as she approached, and his usual reticence gave way to something approaching relief at having someone to tell his story to. "Saw enough of them up at Rose Cottage," he admitted, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Heard them too. Voices carry when the windows are open. Blazing rows about money mostly, and about him coming back. I didn't catch the name, but Mr. Pemberton was terrified of someone. Kept asking me if I'd seen strangers loitering by the back fence." This information transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case entirely. A man living in fear, a wife seeking comfort elsewhere, and a carefully staged crime scene designed to suggest random violence. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Walking home through the lich gate, Miss Marple paused to observe Rose Cottage from this vantage point. From here, anyone attending the flower committee meeting would have had a clear view of the lighted study window and its occupant. The timeline that provided Mrs. Pemberton with such a convenient alibi also placed her in the perfect position to observe her husband's movements throughout the evening. As she unlocked her front door, Miss Marple reflected that murders, like complex knitting patterns, revealed their true design only when one stepped back far enough to see how each thread connected to the whole. Inspector Slack was examining individual stitches and declaring the work complete, but Miss Marple had noticed several dropped threads that would, if followed carefully, unravel the entire fabrication. The dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, and now the revelation of Harold Pemberton's desperate fear painted a very different picture than the one the murderer had so carefully constructed for official consumption. The following afternoon brought news that sent ripples of excitement through St. Mary Mead's carefully ordered existence. Young Constable Polk appeared at Miss Marple's door just as she was settling down with her afternoon tea, his honest face troubled in a way that suggested duty warring with personal conviction. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Inspector Slack's arrested Mr. Geoffrey Fletcher. Found him packing a suitcase this morning, ready to leave the village." Polk shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Thing is, I've known Jeff Fletcher since we were boys at school together, and I can't see him bludgeoning anyone, not even for love or money." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, her blue eyes sharpening with interest. "Mr. Fletcher was involved with Mrs. Pemberton, I take it." The whole village suspected, though they pretended not to notice. Inspector found love letters in Fletcher's rooms, passionate things about running away together and being free at last. There's insurance money, too. £10,000 with Mrs. Pemberton as sole beneficiary. Polk's voice dropped to a whisper. Fletcher won't say where he was between 7 and 11 last night. Just keeps insisting he didn't kill anyone and that Mrs. Pemberton needs protection. After Polk departed, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Reverend Clement in his study with his young wife Griselda perched on the edge of his desk, her face animated with the drama of recent events. "Jane, thank goodness you've come," Griselda exclaimed. "Leonard's been absolutely meticulous about recording everything from the Flower Committee meeting. Tell her what Dorothy said about the telephone call, darling." The vicar consulted his careful notes. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at 7 precisely. She seemed rather distracted throughout the evening, checking her watch frequently. At approximately 8:30, she excused herself to telephone her husband, said she wanted to remind him about some correspondence that needed posting. She was gone perhaps 10 minutes, and when she returned, she seemed much more relaxed, almost cheerful. This detail sent Miss Marple directly to the telephone exchange, where Miss Cade presided over the village's communications with the authority of someone privy to everyone's business. The young woman's eyes widened at Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about calls made from the vicarage the previous evening. Oh yes, Mrs. Pemberton did try to ring Rose Cottage at 8:30. But here's the peculiar thing, the line was engaged. She waited perhaps 2 minutes, tried again, and there was no answer at all. She seemed quite put out by it. Armed with this information, Miss Marple encountered Geoffrey Fletcher himself outside the Blue Boar. He looked haggard and desperate, but agreed readily enough when she suggested they might have a brief conversation about the tragedy. "Everyone thinks I killed him for her," Fletcher said bitterly, settling across from her in the pub's quiet corner. "But the truth is, I was trying to convince Dorothy to leave him before he destroyed her completely. Harold Pemberton was a fraud, Miss Marple. He didn't know history from fairy tales, and he was mixed up with some very unsavory people from his past." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she listened. Unsavory people? He was terrified of someone called Crawford. I heard him mention the name during one of their arguments. Said if Crawford found him, it would be the end of everything. And that window in the study. Fletcher shook his head. "It's the stiffest thing in the house. I've struggled with it myself during my visits, yet Inspector Slack expects us to believe a burglar forced it silently from outside while Pemberton sat peacefully at his desk." Later, at the police station, Miss Marple learned from a triumphant Inspector Slack that Harold Pemberton hadn't even been his real name. "We've traced him back to a financial scandal in Singapore 5 years ago. Lots of people lost money. Lots of people with grudges, and that telephone call he was making when his wife tried to reach him, it was to Scotland Yard's fraud division. Call lasted 7 minutes, ended abruptly at 8:37. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. A young architect in love, positioned perfectly to take blame for a murder he almost certainly hadn't committed. A victim calling the police for protection just moments before his death, and a wife with a meticulously constructed alibi who had tried to telephone her husband at the precise moment he was seeking official help. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not the one Inspector Slack imagined. Someone had staged this crime with theatrical precision, but in their very thoroughness, they had revealed the artificial nature of their creation. Real burglaries were messy, unpredictable affairs. Only in fiction, or carefully planned murder, did everything fall into place quite so neatly. Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly. Tomorrow she would need to have a very careful conversation with Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton. Miss Marple arrived at Rose Cottage the following morning with a small basket containing fresh scones and a pot of her homemade elderberry jam, the sort of neighborly gesture that required no explanation in a village like St. Mary Mead. The morning was grey and threatening rain, with that particular heaviness in the air that made even the most cheerful cottage seem subdued. Rose Cottage bore the unmistakable atmosphere of a house touched by tragedy. Curtains drawn against curious eyes, flowers wilting in their vases, and an unnatural quietness that seemed to press against the windows. Dorothy Pemberton received her in the sitting-room, dressed in elegant black that somehow managed to suggest mourning without conveying actual grief. Her dark hair was swept back with studied simplicity, and while her eyes showed the redness of tears, the rest of her face maintained a composure that struck Miss Marple as remarkably well rehearsed for someone who had discovered her husband's murdered body less than 48 hours earlier. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple," Dorothy said, accepting the basket with hands that trembled only slightly. "I'm afraid I'm rather poor company today. With Geoffrey arrested and all this dreadful business—" She gestured vaguely, as though the enormity of recent events defied more specific description. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in an armchair, her knitting bag positioned within easy reach. "I also wanted to return this, my dear," she said, producing a delicate square of Irish linen from her bag. "Your handkerchief. You left it at my cottage the other night in all the confusion. Such beautiful work. The monogramming is exquisite." Dorothy took the handkerchief with fingers that tightened almost imperceptibly around the fabric. "You're very kind. I'd quite forgotten about it." She folded it carefully, but not before Miss Marple noticed how her knuckles showed white against the delicate linen. Perfectly understandable, given the circumstances. Miss Marple's needles began their familiar clicking rhythm. Such a terrible shock it must have been, returning from the flower committee meeting to find— well, one can hardly imagine. "The meeting ran late," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a story told several times. "We were debating the merits of chrysanthemums versus dahlias for the harvest arrangements. I didn't return until just past 11. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her attention apparently focused on a complex section of her knitting pattern. "And you had tried to telephone Harold during the evening, I understand. Around 8:30. Miss Cade at the exchange mentioned it quite casually." The question hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple observed how Dorothy's teacup rattled almost inaudibly against its saucer. "Yes, I did try to call. The line was engaged initially, and then there was no answer. I assumed Harold had stepped away from his desk for a moment." "How frustrating that must have been," Miss Marple murmured. "Especially as you'd wanted to remind him about correspondence, though I confess I was rather puzzled by something when I saw his study that night. The inkwell on his desk was quite dry, you see, and the fountain pen hadn't been used. For a man supposedly engaged in writing letters all evening, it seemed rather inconsistent." Dorothy's hands stilled completely on her teacup. "Harold often drafted things in pencil first. He was particular about his correspondence, always wanting to get the wording exactly right before committing it to ink." "Of course. How sensible." Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but her blue eyes had sharpened with interest. "And the fireplace being cold on such a chilly evening, that struck me as unusual too. Most gentlemen prefer a fire when working late, don't they? My dear father always insisted upon it, said it helped him think clearly. Harold felt the cold less than most people." Dorothy's voice had acquired a defensive edge that she tried to mask by rising to adjust the curtains. "He was always opening windows, even in winter." Miss Marple continued her knitting, allowing the silence to stretch naturally before speaking again. "Tell me, my dear, had your husband mentioned anyone called Crawford recently? I understand there was some connection to his past business dealings in Singapore." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Dorothy's face drained of all color, and she gripped the window frame as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Where did you hear that name?" "Oh, one hears things in a village," Miss Marple said vaguely, her needles never pausing in their rhythm. "People do talk so, especially when they're concerned. I gather your husband was rather worried about this person." Dorothy turned slowly from the window, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack like ice under pressure. "Harold was terrified of Crawford. He said Crawford had sworn to kill him over some business arrangement that went wrong years ago. We came here to disappear, to hide in village obscurity. But Harold was convinced Crawford had found us. How dreadful for you both, Miss Marple said gently. Living in such fear must have been exhausting. Did you believe these fears were justified, or did you think perhaps Harold's imagination was running away with him? I didn't know what to believe anymore. Dorothy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Harold had told me so many lies about his past, about his business, even about his expertise in antiques and history. I discovered that everything I thought I knew about my husband was false. At that moment, as if summoned by the weight of their conversation, the doorbell rang with sharp insistence. Dorothy excused herself, returning moments later with an official-looking envelope in her trembling hands. Her face had gone completely white. It's from Inspector Slack. They've opened Harold's locked desk drawer. She broke the seal with unsteady fingers, scanning the contents quickly before sinking into her chair. There are documents here, Miss Marple, legal papers showing that Harold was still married to someone else when he married me. Our marriage was never valid. I'm not his widow at all. Miss Marple set down her knitting and leaned forward slightly, her expression combining sympathy with sharp interest. My dear child, what a shock this must be. But you realize what this means, don't you? If you weren't legally married to Harold, then you have no claim to his estate, no access to any insurance money. The financial motive that Inspector Slack has been so eager to assign to you and Mr. Fletcher simply doesn't exist. Dorothy stared at the papers scattered in her lap, her carefully constructed facade finally beginning to crumble. I don't understand. If there was no money involved, then why would anyone think Geoffrey and I? Precisely the question that needs answering, Miss Marple said softly. Because, you see, my dear, someone has gone to considerable trouble to make this murder appear to be the result of a burglary interrupted or a crime of passion motivated by love and money. But if the obvious motives don't exist, then we must look elsewhere for the truth. And I suspect the truth lies not in the future Harold feared, but in the past he was so desperate to escape. She gathered her knitting things with deliberate care, her movements unhurried despite the tension that now filled the room like a tangible presence. I think, Dorothy, that you know far more about that night than you've told anyone. The dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, the perfectly staged scene. Someone arranged Harold's study very carefully after his death, someone who wanted it to look as though he'd been peacefully writing when he was interrupted. But that someone made one crucial error. They didn't know the inkwell was empty. Dorothy's composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand, she whispered, tears beginning to flow freely down her cheeks. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Harold was supposed to be safe here. We both were. Miss Marple paused at the door, her hand resting gently on the frame. My dear, I believe Harold was trying to protect himself that night by calling Scotland Yard. But someone silenced him before he could complete that protection. Someone who knew exactly when he would be alone, exactly when you would be safely accounted for at the vicarage, and exactly how to make his death look like something it wasn't. As she walked down the garden path, Miss Marple reflected that the hidden clue had indeed revealed itself, not in some overlooked object, but in the careful absence of the disorder that should have accompanied 4 hours of correspondence. The dry inkwell was the thread that, when pulled gently but persistently, would unravel the entire carefully woven deception. The real murderer had counted on the villagers' willingness to accept obvious explanations and convenient villains. But they had not counted on an elderly lady with sharp eyes, a lifetime's experience of human nature, and an absolute refusal to accept that coincidences were ever quite as coincidental as they appeared to be. The rain that had threatened all morning finally arrived as Miss Marple made her way home from Rose Cottage, drumming steadily against her umbrella and turning the village lanes into ribbons of gleaming mud. The revelation about Dorothy's invalid marriage had shifted the entire foundation of the case, much like pulling a single thread that unravels an entire piece of knitting. There was no financial motive, no legal inheritance to drive murder, yet someone had constructed an elaborate deception to suggest otherwise. She had barely settled in her sitting room when Dr. Haydock appeared at her door, his medical bag in hand and his weathered face showing the particular expression he wore when professional duty conflicted with personal concern. "Jane, I've just finished a more thorough examination of the body," he said, accepting her offer of tea. "There are details that have been troubling me. The blow that killed Pemberton was delivered with considerable precision, single strike to the base of the skull, angled upward for maximum effect. This wasn't a panicked burglar striking wildly. Someone knew exactly where and how to hit." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she resumed her knitting. "Someone with medical knowledge, perhaps?" "Possibly. But here's what's truly interesting. When I examined Pemberton's right hand, his fingers were clenched around something. A business card, badly crumpled. Name on it was James Crawford, with a London address. Inspector Slack sees it as proof Crawford was there, but I find it rather too convenient. A dying man clutching his killer's calling card?" Before Miss Marple could respond, the telephone rang with sharp insistence. Inspector Slack's voice crackled through the connection, barely containing his frustration. "Miss Marple, thought you should know. We've found Crawford, dead in his London flat for at least 3 days. Natural causes, the Yard says, though they're investigating the circumstances. Point is, whoever killed Pemberton, it wasn't Crawford. Our convenient villain has been eliminated." After Slack rang off, Miss Marple sat quietly for several moments, processing this development. If Crawford had been dead before Pemberton's murder, then the business card clutched in the victim's hand was planted evidence designed to point suspicion toward a ghost. But who would have access to Crawford's card? And more importantly, who would benefit from directing the investigation toward a dead man? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Finch from the antique shop, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. Rain dripped from his coat as he stood in her doorway, his hands trembling slightly. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you. It's about that night, the night Pemberton died. I was there, at Rose Cottage." She settled him by the fire, noting how his eyes darted nervously around the room. "Tell me everything, Mr. Finch. From the beginning." "I went to confront him," Finch admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You see, I knew who he really was. Pemberton wasn't his real name. It was Dabney. Harold Dabney. 20 years ago in Singapore, he embezzled funds from my father's trading company and disappeared, leaving us to face the creditors and the scandal. We lost everything." Miss Marple's needles paused. "So when he appeared in St. Mary Mead, I recognized him immediately, despite the mustache and the years. When he came to my shop with that fraudulent vase, demanding I certify it for insurance purposes, I knew he hadn't changed, still the same cheat and swindler." Finch's hands clenched into fists. "I went to Rose Cottage that evening to confront him, to demand restitution. I reached the back garden gate at 7:30. "And did you enter the house?" "No, because someone was already there. I could hear voices in the study. Pemberton pleading, actually crying. The other voice was low, cultured, terrifying in its coldness. Then the arguing stopped abruptly, and something very strange happened." Finch paused, his face pale with the memory. "The light in the study went out completely for perhaps 10 seconds, then blazed back on. I lost my nerve and fled." Miss Marple set down her knitting entirely, her blue eyes sharpening with interest. "The light went out, you say? Are you quite certain it wasn't simply someone passing in front of the window?" "It went completely dark, then bright again, as if someone had turned off the electric light, then switched it back on." Finch shuddered. "I knew something terrible was happening, but I was too much a coward to intervene." After Finch departed, Miss Marple retrieved Dorothy's handkerchief from her drawer, examining once again the faint, dark smudge at one corner. In light of Finch's testimony, the stain took on new significance. Not tears or cosmetics, but something darker. Soot, perhaps, or coal dust. The kind of residue that might transfer from handling a poker that had lain long beside an unused fireplace. She walked to her window, gazing out at Rose Cottage through the rain. The pieces were forming a pattern now, though not the one Inspector Slack imagined. A victim who had tried to call for police protection, silenced before he could complete his plea for help. A witness who had observed the critical moment when the murderer had extinguished the lights, not to hide from outside observers, but to move about the room unseen while repositioning evidence. A carefully planted business card pointing toward a conveniently dead suspect. Most tellingly, there was the precision of the murder itself. Dr. Haydick's assessment suggested someone with knowledge of anatomy, someone who could strike once and fatally. Combined with the staged burglary scene and the planted evidence, it painted a picture of calculated premeditation rather than passionate impulse. The telephone rang again, this time bringing news that sent a chill through Miss Marple's usually composed demeanor. It was Constable Polk, his young voice tight with worry. "Miss Marple, there's been an incident at the jail. Someone tried to poison Mr. Fletcher's dinner. We caught it in time. The constable on duty noticed the food smelled wrong, but it means someone's trying very hard to ensure he hangs for this murder." As she replaced the receiver, Miss Marple reflected that the real murderer was still active, still working to ensure their carefully constructed deception held firm. They had eliminated Crawford as a threat by pointing suspicion toward a dead man, but Geoffrey Fletcher remained a loose thread that needed cutting. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows as Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Somewhere in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, behind a facade of respectability and concern, a killer waited to see if their elaborate performance would survive the scrutiny of an elderly lady who understood that the most dangerous murderers were often those who appeared most helpful, most concerned, most eager to assist with the investigation. The dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, the precisely positioned poker, the planted business card, and now the attempt on Fletcher's life. Each element revealed not panic or passion, but the methodical mind of someone who planned not just murder, but the perfect frame for an innocent man. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. Tomorrow, she would need to have a very careful conversation with someone who had been remarkably eager to help with the investigation from the very beginning. The morning brought an unexpected discovery that would prove to be the final thread needed to unravel the carefully woven deception. Miss Marple had barely finished her breakfast when Griselda Clement appeared at her door, breathless with excitement and clutching something wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple, you must come to the church immediately. I found something dreadful in the vestry." Her young face was pale with shock as she unwrapped a man's gardening glove, stained with mud and something darker that had dried to a rusty brown. It was stuffed behind the radiator. It wasn't there before Tuesday night. I'm absolutely certain because I dropped my earring back there during our preparation for the flower committee meeting. At the church, Miss Marple examined the glove without touching it, noting the dark stains on both palm and wrist. The vestry's separate entrance from the churchyard provided a clear line of sight to Rose Cottage, and more importantly, it offered a perfect route for someone who needed to slip away unnoticed during the meeting. "Tell me about Tuesday evening's proceedings," Miss Marple requested gently. "Was there any period when someone might have left without being noticed?" Griselda nodded eagerly. Mrs. Price-Ridley gave a 30-minute lecture on harvest festival traditions. She dimmed all the lights for her lantern slides, and honestly, it was so tedious that half of us nearly dozed off. Anyone could have slipped out through the vestry door during that time. The pattern crystallized with startling clarity. Mrs. Price-Ridley hadn't simply attended the meeting. She had orchestrated it to provide herself with the perfect opportunity. The lecture, The dimmed lights, the convenient 30-minute window when her absence would go completely unnoticed. Miss Marple made her way directly to the imposing Price-Ridley residence, where she found the lady of the house in her morning room, arranging flowers with the sort of aggressive precision that suggested barely controlled agitation. "My dear Mrs. Price-Ridley," Miss Marple began pleasantly, settling herself without invitation. "I've just come from the church. Such an interesting discovery Griselda made in the vestry. A gardening glove, rather badly stained. The sort of thing someone might discard in haste after an unpleasant task." The older woman's hands stilled on the chrysanthemums, and Miss Marple observed how her knuckles whitened as she gripped the flower stems. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Miss Marple said softly. "You see, I've been wondering about that lecture you gave on Tuesday evening. Such perfect timing. 30 minutes of darkness, with everyone's attention focused on your slides. Long enough for someone to slip out through the vestry, cross the churchyard to Rose Cottage, commit murder, and return before the lights came up." Mrs. Price-Ridley's composure began to crack like ice under pressure. "You're being ridiculous, Miss Marple. I was conducting the meeting the entire evening." "Oh, but you weren't, were you? You had arranged for the lights to be dimmed, for your voice to continue from the front of the room while you slipped away. Perhaps you even prepared your slides to run automatically, or enlisted an unwitting accomplice to advance them. The beauty of it was that everyone would remember your voice, your presence, without actually seeing you during those crucial minutes." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she continued. "And then there's the matter of all that helpful information you've provided throughout this investigation. You knew about Mr. Fletcher's visits to Rose Cottage, about the Pembertons' private affairs, about Harold's supposed expertise in antiques. You were remarkably well informed for someone who claimed barely to know them." The flower arrangement forgotten, Mrs. Price-Ridley sank into her chair, her face draining of color. "You don't understand what that man did to my family." "Crawford was your maiden name, wasn't it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "And James Crawford, whose business card was so conveniently clutched in Harold's hand, he was your brother. The brother whose life Harold Dabney destroyed in Singapore with his embezzlement schemes." The confession, when it came, poured out with the force of long-suppressed hatred. "James died 3 years ago, broken and penniless because of that monster. When Harold appeared here, calling himself Pemberton, pretending to be a respectable historian, I knew I had to act. Justice demanded it." "But justice didn't require destroying innocent people," Miss Marple observed quietly. "You planted evidence systematically. Crawford's business card, the letter about the bigamy, even the forced window to suggest burglary. You were willing to see Mr. Fletcher hang, to watch Dorothy suffer, all to satisfy your need for revenge." Mrs. Price-Ridley's mask finally slipped completely. "They were obstacles, nothing more. Collateral damage in a necessary war. And the poison in Mr. Fletcher's food? Another attempt to eliminate an inconvenient witness. He was becoming suspicious, asking too many questions about timing and alibis. I couldn't allow him to piece together the truth." Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression combining sadness with resolve. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Price-Ridley, that Inspector Slack will need to hear this conversation. Murder dressed up as justice is still murder, and the innocent deserve protection from those who would sacrifice them for their own ends." As she walked toward the door, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were indeed those who convinced themselves their crimes served a higher purpose. Mrs. Price-Ridley had orchestrated not just a murder, but an elaborate performance designed to destroy multiple lives while positioning herself as the helpful neighbor. The dry inkwell, the planted evidence, the systematic deception, all had been carefully calculated to create the perfect crime. But perfection, Miss Marple knew, was a human impossibility. There was always a loose thread, a forgotten detail, a moment of carelessness that revealed the truth to those patient enough to look for it. In this case, it had been the arrogance of believing that helpfulness could serve as the perfect disguise for malice. Inspector Slack arrived at the Price-Ridley residence within the hour, his red face bearing the particular expression of a man whose professional pride warred with grudging respect for amateur detection. Mrs. Price-Ridley had retreated into the icy composure that had served her so well throughout her life, sitting rigidly in her morning room as though the force of her will alone could repel the accusations that now surrounded her like gathering storm clouds. "I have nothing further to say," she announced coldly as Slack entered, flanked by Constable Pock. "I was overwrought earlier, speaking nonsense under the influence of shock and grief. Miss Marple has allowed village gossip to run away with her imagination, constructing elaborate fantasies from coincidence and malice." But Miss Marple had anticipated this retreat into respectability. From her handbag, she produced a small leather notebook in which she had methodically recorded every conversation, every observation, every seemingly insignificant detail that had accumulated since that midnight knock at her door. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe you'll find that Mrs. Price-Ridley's lecture on Tuesday evening was recorded on gramophone discs. If you examine her study, you'll discover the equipment she used to project her voice while she was actually absent from the church hall. The technology is quite ingenious. Multiple records set to play in sequence, creating the perfect illusion of continuous presence." Slack's eyes sharpened with understanding, and he immediately dispatched Pock to search the adjoining study. The young constable returned within minutes, carrying a portable gramophone and a stack of records carefully labeled in Mrs. Price-Ridley's distinctive handwriting. Harvest Festival History, Part 1. Harvest Festival History, Part 2, and so forth. "There's more," Miss Marple continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her words. "The so-called forced window at Rose Cottage shows tool marks made from the inside, not the outside. Someone opened that window after the murder and deliberately created scratches to suggest external forcing. The real entry was through the unlocked garden gate, which Mrs. Price-Ridley could access directly from the churchyard without being observed. Mrs. Price-Ridley's carefully maintained facade began to crack like ice under pressure. "You understand nothing," she said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Nothing about justice. Nothing about the debt that needed paying." "I understand revenge," Miss Marple replied gently. "James Crawford was your brother, wasn't he? The brother whose life Harold Dabney destroyed in Singapore with his embezzlement schemes. When you discovered Dabney hiding here under the name Pemberton, pretending to be a respectable historian, you saw an opportunity for the justice that had been denied your family." The confession, when it finally came, poured forth with the force of long-suppressed hatred. James died broken and penniless because of that monster. 3 years of watching him waste away, knowing the man who destroyed him was living comfortably somewhere under a false name. When Harold appeared here, I knew divine providence had delivered him into my hands for judgment. "But you didn't simply execute that judgment," Miss Marple observed. "You constructed an elaborate performance to ensure innocent people would suffer alongside your true target. You planted your dead brother's business card in Harold's hand, positioned the poker with theatrical precision, arranged the desk to suggest interrupted correspondence despite the dry inkwell that proved he hadn't been writing at all." Slack had been taking notes furiously, his earlier skepticism giving way to professional focus. "What about the telephone call? Pemberton was calling Scotland Yard when he died." Mrs. Price-Ridley's laugh was bitter and triumphant. "Perfect timing, really. I entered through the garden and saw him at his desk with the telephone receiver pressed to his ear, pleading for police protection from threats he thought were still coming. He was so focused on his desperate call that he never heard me approach. One precise blow to the base of the skull, angled exactly as I'd learned during my years of nursing training, and his cowardly voice fell silent forever." "And the lights going out?" Miss Marple prompted, remembering Mr. Finch's testimony. "I needed darkness to reposition everything, the body, the poker, the papers on his desk. 10 seconds was sufficient. I'd rehearsed every movement, timed every action down to the minute." Despite her circumstances, Mrs. Price-Ridley's voice carried unmistakable pride. The gramophone records provided my alibi at the church. The staged burglary would explain the death, and young Fletcher's obvious infatuation with Dorothy would supply motive for the police. It should have been perfect. Except for the details that betrayed the performance, Miss Marple said softly. The dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, the handkerchief Dorothy dropped at my cottage, stained with soot from the poker you'd positioned so carefully. And most revealing of all, your own compulsion to insert yourself into the investigation, to guide suspicions and provide helpful information that only the murderer could possibly know. Slack rose heavily, his hand moving to the handcuffs at his belt. Mrs. Edith Price-Ridley, I'm arresting you for the murder of Harold Pemberton, also known as Harold Dabney. You'll need to come with us. As the officers prepared to lead her away, Mrs. Price-Ridley turned back to Miss Marple with an expression of pure, undiluted hatred. You've destroyed me for the sake of a bigamist and a fraud. Harold Dabney was worthless, a parasite who deserved everything he received and more. Perhaps, Miss Marple acknowledged quietly. But Geoffrey Fletcher didn't deserve to hang for your revenge, and Dorothy didn't deserve to have her life destroyed by your schemes. Justice, Mrs. Price-Ridley, cannot be achieved through injustice, no matter how righteous the original grievance may seem. After they departed, Miss Marple remained in the morning room for several moments, surrounded by the comfortable furnishings and half-finished flower arrangements that had witnessed the complete unraveling of a carefully constructed deception. She reflected on how thoroughly someone could convince themselves that their crimes served a higher purpose, and how easily respectability could mask the deepest malice. The case had revealed itself through accumulated inconsistencies, small details that individually meant nothing, but together painted an unmistakable picture of theatrical staging rather than authentic tragedy. Most telling had been Mrs. Price-Ridley's own behavior throughout the investigation, her eagerness to help that stemmed not from neighborly concern, but from the murderer's compulsion to control the narrative of their carefully orchestrated crime. Walking home through the village streets, Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead would be profoundly shaken by the revelation that one of its most prominent citizens had committed cold-blooded murder. But beneath the shock would run a current of relief. Relief that Geoffrey Fletcher would be freed, that Dorothy could begin rebuilding her shattered life, and that the real killer had been exposed before more innocent lives could be destroyed by the deadly performance of respectability masking revenge. The news of Mrs. Price-Ridley's arrest rippled through St. Mary Mead like a stone dropped into still water, each concentric circle of shock and disbelief spreading further until the entire village trembled with the revelation. For once, the customary appetite for gossip faltered beneath genuine bewilderment. That such calculated malice could have lurked behind that monument of respectability unsettled even the most cynical tongues, leaving neighbors to eye each other with newfound wariness. Miss Marple, however, knew that one final duty remained before the case could be properly concluded. Inspector Slack appeared at her cottage that evening, his usual bluster replaced by something approaching humility as he stood hat in hand at her doorstep. "They've moved Mrs. Price-Ridley to the county jail," he reported, accepting her offer of tea with unusual politeness. "She's alternating between speeches about divine justice and complete silence. The chief constable thinks it would benefit everyone, particularly Fletcher and Mrs. Pemberton, if the whole business were properly explained. No rumors, no half-truths. Would you consider gathering everyone together?" Miss Marple finished gently. "Yes, I believe that would be wisest. People suffer more from uncertainty than from unpleasant truth, however painful that truth might be." The following afternoon found Rose Cottage's drawing room filled once more, though the atmosphere bore little resemblance to that terrible night when murder had first violated its peace. Dorothy sat by the window in a dress of pale blue rather than morning black, her hands steady now though her eyes still carried shadows of recent trauma. Geoffrey Fletcher occupied the chair nearest to her, his face bearing the particular pallor of a man who had contemplated the hangman's noose and lived to speak of it. Dr. Haydock positioned himself near the mantelpiece with professional detachment, while Reverend Clement and his wife Griselda represented the village's need for understanding. Inspector Slack took his customary position by the door, notebook tucked away for once. Miss Marple settled in the armchair that had become informally hers throughout this investigation, her knitting bag within reach, though her hands remained folded in her lap. "I think," she began in her mild voice, "we should examine this case from the beginning, in proper order. Truth is so often obscured by first impressions and theatrical staging. We were all invited to believe that Harold Pemberton died at the hands of a burglar, or perhaps a jealous lover, because everything in that study had been arranged to tell exactly such a story." Dorothy's gaze moved involuntarily toward the study door, now standing open to afternoon sunlight that seemed to cleanse away the shadows of that terrible night. "The beauty of Mrs. Price-Ridley's plan," Miss Marple continued, "lay in its misdirection. She understood that people naturally seek the most obvious explanation, particularly when that explanation is supported by compelling physical evidence. The forced window, the conveniently placed poker, the victim's hand clutching his supposed killer's business card. It was theater of the highest order. Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. She seemed so concerned, so helpful throughout the investigation. "I never suspected—" "That was precisely her greatest weapon," Miss Marple replied. "Respectability and neighborly concern make perfect camouflage for those who wish to observe their handiwork while appearing above suspicion." She positioned herself at the very center of the investigation, feeding information and theories that would guide the police toward the conclusions she desired. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "The Inkwell was what started you thinking, wasn't it?" "Indeed. Dorothy had told us Harold spent the evening writing correspondence, yet the inkwell was bone dry and the fountain pen unused. More telling still, the fireplace was cold on a rather chilly night, though gentlemen working late nearly always prefer a small fire for comfort. This suggested Harold hadn't been settling to a long evening's work at all. He was waiting, nervously, for something or someone. He was terrified, Dorothy said softly. Of Crawford, of his past catching up with him. I thought he was imagining half of it. Not entirely, Miss Marple acknowledged. But the fascinating point is that Crawford was already dead in London, had been for days. Someone knew this fact would eventually emerge and deliberately used his name as misdirection, confident that the scandal attached to it would cloud everything else. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. What convinced me medically was the precision of the fatal blow. Single strike, perfect angle for maximum damage. That wasn't rage or panic. That was execution by someone who understood anatomy. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. Execution by someone with nursing training. Someone who had tended the wounded during wartime and learned exactly where to strike to ensure silence and swift death. Mrs. Price-Ridley's service as a VAD nurse provided just that knowledge. She paused, allowing the implications to settle before continuing. But the truly ingenious aspect was her alibi. The gramophone records were a masterpiece of planning, her entire Harvest Festival lecture recorded and set to play in sequence while the hall lights were dimmed for lantern slides. Everyone heard her voice throughout those crucial 30 minutes. No one actually saw her during the period when Harold died. The lights going out in the study, Fletcher said suddenly, his voice strained with memory. I was in the garden that night, Miss Marple. I heard voices through the window, Harold pleading, someone else speaking in tones so cold they froze my blood. Then came the sound of something heavy falling. The lights went out completely for perhaps 10 seconds, then blazed back on. I panicked and fled. Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. Thank you for that confirmation, Mr. Fletcher. Mrs. Price-Ridley needed those moments of darkness to reposition the body and arrange her theatrical staging without being observed from outside. She was working against time, knowing her gramophone performance would provide only a limited window of opportunity. But why frame Geoffrey specifically? Dorothy asked, her hand finding Fletcher's. Because you represented everything she despised, Miss Marple said gently. In her mind, you were the foolish woman who had believed a charming swindler, just as the investors in Singapore had once failed to see through Harold's schemes. Mr. Fletcher, being obviously devoted to you, made an ideal candidate for the role of passionate murderer. It satisfied her sense of poetic justice while providing the police with a neat, comprehensible motive. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of village life continuing its eternal rhythm beyond the windows. Finally, Fletcher spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She would have let me hang for it. All those sympathetic visits to the jail, those assurances that truth would prevail. She was watching me like a scientist observing an experiment. She would indeed, Miss Marple confirmed. Her attempt to poison your food proved that beyond doubt. When she realized you might piece together inconsistencies in the timeline, she decided to eliminate you before you could voice your suspicions. Fortunately, Constable Polk's vigilance prevented that final tragedy. Inspector Slack stirred uncomfortably. I should have seen through the staging myself. The evidence was almost too perfect, too convenient. Don't reproach yourself too harshly, Inspector, Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Price-Ridley understood police procedure intimately and constructed her deception accordingly. She knew you would follow the most obvious trail, particularly when it was supported by physical evidence and apparent motive. Her fatal error was in overreaching. The poisoning attempt revealed the ongoing nature of her involvement when a truly innocent person would have trusted justice to take its course. Dorothy looked around the room that had been the stage for such elaborate deception. What happens now? To Harold's estate, to this house? The legal complications will sort themselves out in time, Miss Marple replied. The fact that your marriage was invalid actually protects you from Harold's creditors and legal entanglements. You're free to build a new life on foundations of truth rather than the quicksand of his fabrications. Fletcher straightened, some color returning to his face. We've talked about leaving St. Mary Mead, starting fresh somewhere without these shadows. Villages have long memories, Miss Marple observed, but they also possess surprising capacity for sympathy once the dust settles. You may find that St. Mary Mead remembers you more kindly than you expect. Still, the choice must be yours. As the gathering dispersed, each person carrying away their own understanding of the events that had shattered their peaceful community, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting finally emerging from its bag. The familiar click of needles provided a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. The case had been a complex tapestry of deception, Harold's false identity, Mrs. Price-Ridley's staged alibi, the carefully planted evidence designed to frame an innocent man. Each thread had been woven with meticulous care, yet the pattern had ultimately revealed itself through the accumulation of small inconsistencies that betrayed the artificial nature of the whole. Walking home through the village streets as evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of justice and revenge. Mrs. Price-Ridley had convinced herself that her actions served a higher purpose, that she was an instrument of divine retribution rather than a common murderer. Yet her willingness to destroy innocent lives in pursuit of that revenge had revealed the fundamental corruption of her cause. The dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, the precisely positioned poker, each detail had been a note in a carefully orchestrated symphony of deception. But like all human constructions, the performance had contained flaws that sharp eyes and patient observation could detect. Truth, Miss Marple knew, had a way of asserting itself, despite the most elaborate attempts at concealment. St. Mary Mead would heal from this wound as it had from others, absorbing the shock and scandal into the fabric of its collective memory. But beneath the restored surface, calm, the village had learned a valuable lesson about the danger of accepting obvious explanations and trusting too readily in the camouflage of respectability. Sometimes the most dangerous predators were those who wore the mask of concerned neighbor while orchestrating destruction with methodical precision. As she unlocked her front door and stepped into the familiar comfort of her cottage, Miss Marple smiled slightly at the thought that somewhere in the darkness, human nature continued its eternal dance between light and shadow, kindness and malice, truth and deception. And when that dance next disturbed the peace of her small corner of the world, she would be ready with her knitting needles, her sharp eyes, and her lifetime's understanding of the infinite complexity of the human heart. The weeks that followed Mrs. Price-Ridley's arrest brought an autumn of reckoning to St. Mary Mead as the village struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the calculating murderer who had hidden behind a mask of respectability. The initial shock that had silenced even the most devoted gossips gradually gave way to a peculiar form of collective healing, though not without leaving permanent scars on the community's sense of itself. The most visible manifestation of this transformation came on a crisp November morning when the contents of the Price-Ridley residence went under the auctioneer's hammer. Miss Marple attended, not to bid, but to observe as her neighbors dismantled a lifetime of accumulated authority, lot by lot. There was something profoundly melancholic in watching the grand mahogany dining table, upon which Mrs. Price-Ridley had undoubtedly planned her elaborate revenge, being sold to the butcher's wife for a fraction of its value. The silver tea service that had graced so many village committee meetings found new ownership with Mrs. Hartnell, who clutched her purchase as though she had bought tangible proof that the nightmare was truly over. "It feels rather ghoulish, doesn't it?" Griselda Clement whispered, watching as a box of lantern slides, the very ones used to construct that ingenious alibi, was held aloft for inspection. "But I suppose it's their way of reassuring themselves that respectability can be bought and sold like everything else." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Not a monster being exorcised, my dear, but rather the dismantling of an illusion." Mrs. Price-Ridley understood that people naturally trust those who occupy positions of social prominence, and she used that trust as her deadliest weapon. The afternoon brought a final visitor before the London train departed. Dorothy Pemberton, she had resumed her maiden name of Ashford, arrived with Geoffrey Fletcher, both transformed by their ordeal into something stronger than they had been before. The strained, haunted expression that had marked Dorothy's features since that terrible midnight had vanished, replaced by a quiet resilience that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "We're leaving for Cornwall tomorrow," Dorothy announced, accepting Miss Marple's offer of tea. "Geoffrey has been offered work on a coastal restoration project, and I've found a position as a secretary. Far enough away to breathe freely, close enough to the sea to remember that the world is larger than our small tragedies." "A wise decision," Miss Marple approved, noting how their hands remained intertwined even as they spoke of practical arrangements. Sometimes distance provides the perspective necessary for proper healing. But do remember that one cannot simply run away from the past. One must pack it away neatly, acknowledging it exists while refusing to let it dominate the present. Geoffrey shifted in his chair, his expression growing thoughtful. "The thing that haunts me most is how completely she fooled everyone. Mrs. Price-Ridley seemed so concerned, so helpful throughout the investigation. I never suspected that her eagerness to assist was actually the murderer's compulsion to control the narrative. That is perhaps the most valuable lesson from this terrible business," Miss Marple observed. "The deadliest predators are often those who appear most harmless, most respectable, most eager to help. True innocence allows investigations to unfold naturally. It doesn't orchestrate them." After they departed to catch their train and begin their new life, Miss Marple remained in her sitting room as twilight gathered. The vicar appeared just as the first stars emerged, settling into the chair opposite with the weary satisfaction of a man whose parish had weathered its darkest storm. "Tell me, Jane," Leonard Clement asked, "was there truly a moment when you knew for certain, before all the evidence accumulated?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. "It was the gardening glove in the vestry, Leonard. You see, it reminded me of a similar incident with my Aunt Helen's cook." a woman of impeccable habits who would never leave a greasy rag behind the pantry radiator unless she was hiding something significant. Mrs. Price-Ridley prided herself on absolute control, yet there was that dirty glove stuffed carelessly behind the radiator. It spoke of a moment of panic, a deviation from character that betrayed the entire deception. She paused, counting stitches with practiced precision. People may wear masks, but they rarely fit perfectly. There is always a slip, a loose thread, a dry inkwell that reveals the artificial nature of the performance. The village settled into its evening quiet around them, lights flickering on in cottage windows as St. Mary Mead resumed its eternal rhythm. The scandal would fade in time, becoming another layer in the community's collective memory, but it had taught valuable lessons about the danger of accepting obvious explanations and trusting too readily in the camouflage of respectability. Miss Marple smiled slightly as she worked, content in the knowledge that truth, like her knitting, revealed its pattern one careful stitch at a time to those willing to pay attention to the details others overlooked. Mrs. Price-Ridley had counted on the village's willingness to accept theatrical staging as reality, but she had not counted on an elderly lady with sharp eyes and a lifetime's understanding of human nature. As the clock chimed 9, Miss Marple reflected that peace had been restored to her corner of the world, the guilty exposed, the innocent freed, justice served despite the elaborate deception designed to prevent it. But she knew this tranquility was temporary, as it always was. As long as there were people, there would be secrets, and as long as there were secrets, there would be those who tried to bury truth beneath carefully constructed lies. The case was closed, the village would heal, and life in St. Mary Mead would continue its gentle flow through the seasons. But Miss Marple would remember the dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, and the lesson that the most dangerous criminals were often those who hid behind masks of concern and respectability. When the next midnight knock came, and she knew it would, she would be ready with her knitting needles, her sharp observation, and her absolute refusal to accept that coincidences were ever quite as coincidental as they appeared to be. Winter arrived in St. Mary Mead with unusual suddenness that year, as though nature itself wished to draw a clean white sheet over the autumn's ugliness. The first snow fell on the morning Inspector Slack brought news of the trial's conclusion, his red face bearing an expression of grudging satisfaction as he stood in Missy Marple's doorway, stamping frost from his boots. "Guilty on all counts," he reported, accepting her offer of tea with something approaching gratitude. Transportation for life. Mrs. Price-Ridley showed no remorse whatsoever, kept insisting she'd serve divine justice even as the judge pronounced sentence. She'll spend her remaining years in a women's prison, far from St. Mary Mead and her delusions of righteousness. After Slack departed, Miss Marple settled by her window to watch the village transform beneath its blanket of snow. The sharp edges of scandal were already being softened by winter's touch, and she observed with satisfaction how quickly St. Mary Mead was healing from its wounds. Rose Cottage, in particular, showed the most dramatic transformation. New tenants had arrived the previous week, Mr. and Mrs. Gable, a retired schoolmaster, and his wife, pleasant people with no connection to murder or deception. Miss Marple had called on them with a welcoming basket, noting how completely they had exorcised the cottage's dark memories. The study window stood open to winter sunshine, the desk bore genuine correspondence in natural disarray, and a cheerful fire crackled in the grate, where once there had been only cold calculation. Most tellingly, the inkwell brimmed with fresh ink, ready for actual use rather than theatrical display. A letter had arrived that morning from Cornwall, written in Dorothy's careful hand. She and Geoffrey Fletcher had married quietly in a small coastal church, witnessed only by strangers who knew nothing of midnight murders or elaborate deceptions. Their new life was built on foundations of honesty rather than the quicksand of secrets, and Dorothy's words carried a contentment entirely absent during her time as the fraudulent Mrs. Pemberton. "We think of you often," she had written, "and marvel at how you saw through the performance when everyone else was convinced by the staging. Geoffrey says you possess an almost supernatural ability to detect falsehood, but I believe it's simpler. You understand that people reveal their true nature not in grand gestures, but in small inconsistencies, in the details they overlook when constructing their masks. Dr. Haydock arrived as afternoon shadows lengthened, settling by the fire with the weary satisfaction of a man whose community had weathered its darkest storm. "It's the arrogance that still astounds me," he mused, warming his hands around his teacup. Mrs. Price-Ridley genuinely believed her cause elevated her above moral law. The coldness of using gramophone records to establish an alibi while committing murder suggests a detachment that's frankly pathological. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she worked on a new project, a scarf for the vicar's Christmas present, its complex pattern requiring absolute attention and strict adherence to rules. Arrogance, yes, but also the peculiar blindness that accompanies it. She was so convinced of her grand design's magnificence that she overlooked the small details, the dry inkwell, the cold fireplace, that ultimately betrayed her. It reminds me of my old headmistress, Miss Crabtree, who refused to apologize even when proven wrong because she simply couldn't conceive of her judgment being fallible. And you saw that same quality immediately, from the very beginning. The way she insisted on directing the investigation, always suggesting theories, pointing out obvious guilt. It wasn't merely deflection. She enjoyed the puppetry, derived satisfaction from making everyone dance to her composition. That kind of pride is always dangerous because it assumes trifles cannot undo magnificence. As evening settled over the snow-covered village, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of justice and human self-deception. Mrs. Price-Ridley had convinced herself that murder served a higher purpose, that she was divine retribution's instrument rather than a common criminal. Yet her willingness to destroy innocent lives revealed the fundamental corruption at her cause's heart. True justice required mercy alongside judgment. Revenge dressed in righteous garments remained revenge nonetheless. The case would become village legend, growing and changing with each retelling until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. But the essential truth would remain. An elderly lady with knitting needles and sharp eyes had seen through elaborate performance to expose calculated malice beneath respectable facades. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and resumed her knitting, each stitch requiring precision and care. One dropped thread could ruin the entire fabric, much like murder. Small inconsistencies in even the most carefully planned deception would eventually reveal the artificial nature of the whole. The dry inkwell had been such a thread, and pulling it gently but persistently had unraveled Mrs. Price-Ridley's entire fabrication. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the tracks of guilty and innocent alike. Somewhere beyond her window, human nature continued its eternal dance between kindness and cruelty, truth and deception. The midnight knock would come again. It always did, bringing fresh mysteries to unravel. But for now, peace reigned in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple smiled contentedly, secure in the knowledge that truth, like her knitting, revealed its pattern one careful stitch at a time to those patient enough to observe what others overlooked.